So good morning and welcome to the show. I'm Tom Kennedy and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a partner here at RBT CPAs in the government and healthcare practices, and I'm filling in for my friend and partner, Jonathan Ruiz, who's decided to take a vacation this week. Jonathan will be returning to the show next week. This morning, I'm joined by Jen George, partner with RBT. Jen serves as the Director of Compliance in our firm and is our technical guru. Thank you. Also with us is Linda Hannigan, a Government Director with our firm. Linda has nearly 30 years of experience serving municipalities in the Hudson Valley and just about every type of government. Just a quick reminder, last week's show and all previous shows are available on the RBT website at www.rbtcpas.com. So we plan to run this show for the next few weeks and beyond, if necessary, to bring you the latest and greatest developments around ARPA. So for the first 30 minutes of today's show, we'll delve into today's topic with our experts, and we'll wrap up with 15 minutes of Q&A. So please use the chat function to submit your questions. So I want to start today's show with a brief recap of last week's show. Jen and Linda and our esteemed guests have been providing overviews of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, in the section called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, as well as various amounts of funding allotted to entitlement units, which you're aware are states, counties, and metropolitan cities, and the amounts allocated to non-entitlement units, or NEUs, our towns and villages. Of course, of which 350 billion, that's B with a B, billion, is going to state and local tribal governments. First off, this week, there's a very important deadline for New York State NEUs to accept, thumbs up, or decline funding by this Friday, July 9. So let me go out on a limb and suggest you should accept. Go to the New York State Division of Budget website to get your application in. Again, that's Friday of this week. Also, last week we discussed eligible and ineligible uses of the funds and provided some insights from some of our local leaders. I also want to share that there have been no new FAQs issued since our last show. And we now know, although we've long suspected, that ARPA funds will be subject to the single audit. So this week, we'll focus on what that means for local municipalities. And since there's a lot to cover, we're devoting this entire show to it. So let's get started. So Jen, good morning.
Good morning.
What is a single audit?
Yes. So single audit, we keep throwing this word around, and if you've been through it, you understand. If you haven't, you have no idea what this means. So I'm going to give you a little background on where this comes from. The federal government every year gives out billions and billions of dollars in awards. Actually, in 2019, the federal government aid to state and local governments was about $721 billion. Now, that was 2019. Add on top of that, this state and local relief funds will now add another $350 billion. So that's about half of what was given out in 2019. We're talking about a tremendous amount of money. The federal departments give out these awards, and there are actually over 70 departments at the federal government that make awards to various local governments and also to not-for-profits. And each one of those departments is responsible for making sure that the entities that receive this funding are doing what they're supposed to do with the money. So back in the old days, what would happen is that each of these departments would send out their own auditors to the various municipalities to go and check and audit how they were spending the money. So that meant that any one municipality might have 5 or 6 different auditors coming through their door at any time during the year because each one was coming in to check a specific program. Well, somebody finally realized that that was a little bit excessive and that municipalities didn't want to have auditors in there all the time. So in the early 1980s, what they did is they switched to this concept of an entity-wide audit, or a single audit. Rather than multiple, now you have one single audit of all of your federal funding. And the single audits are now conducted by, generally they're conducted by outside CPA firms. Some states actually have their state accounting department will conduct these, but generally it's outside CPA firms. And what the single audit purpose is, it's not really looking at financial statements necessarily. It looks at, first of all, did the entity actually comply with the grant requirements? And then the second fun piece is, did the entity have internal controls in place to make sure that it will always comply with the requirements? And so you might say, well, why does that matter? I mean, as long as you complied, that's the important part, right? Well, the important part is to make sure that you actually have controls so that the government feels confident that if they give you money, that you will be able to have controls in place to make sure you spend it correctly all the time. To quote one of my husband's sayings, every now and then, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. So just because you happen to get it right doesn't mean that you will always get it right. So that's why we have to look at internal controls.
Thanks, Jen. Linda, what's involved in a single audit?
Well, as Jen mentioned, it's an entity-wide audit. So not only are we looking at the particular federal programs, we're looking at the local municipality, the entity as a whole. So for example, we'll be including in the single audit, the audit of the financial statements and the compliance audit as well, so that the auditor could look at the entity's internal controls entity-wide and come to certain conclusions and provide certain reports. So technically, in a single audit, there's an audit of the financial statements with an opinion, and then there is an opinion on internal controls and compliance on financial statements, which is entity-wide. And then further, there's a report on compliance with federal programs and internal controls over those federal programs. So you can see it focuses on the entity and on the federal programs as well. So when you're looking at the federal programs, in order to determine which federal programs you're looking at, there is what's known as a schedule of expenditures of federal awards. And that schedule that's prepared by the audited entity determines what programs the auditors actually test. And again, going back to the dollar cutoffs, a single audit is required when an entity expends $750,000 or more federal dollars in its fiscal year. And I want to emphasize that it expends the federal dollars, not necessarily when it receives federal dollars. And that is key to determining the extent of the federal awards in a particular year. So also what's included, obviously, is tests of compliance, so that depending on the major programs that are determined based on the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, you will be testing compliance with certain requirements of certain programs. You'll also be looking at tests of controls over compliance. As Jen was mentioning before, that just because you happen to get it right, it's more important that you have controls in place that ensure and monitor that you will get it right, that you know that the controls are there, that all of the compliance requirements will be met. And that's very important. And it's part of the reporting process. We report on controls over financial reporting and on compliance with requirements on federal programs. There are also reports that are filed with the federal government. Once the single audit is complete, the entity is required to file what's known as a data collection form with the Federal Clearinghouse. That lists all the programs and all the findings, if any, that were found. There also, the entity is expected to prepare a response a action plan in order to resolve the findings that were cited in the single audit. So it's a fairly comprehensive audit. It looks again at your financial statement results and on compliance, not only with financial reporting, but also on the federal programs itself.
Got it. So basically, the purpose of a single audit is to test whether an entity is complied with the federal compliance requirements. So Jen, what are some of these requirements?
Okay, so this is the heart of the issue here. There are a total of, I believe, 16 compliance requirements that the government has identified as these are the universal compliance requirements that you need to address with every award. Some of the compliance requirements don't really apply to a particular award. So in this case, since we're focused on the state and local relief funds, we're going to break them down into basically the primary requirements and then some other requirements. And in the other requirements, we'll talk about things that could possibly apply, but most likely will not for this particular funding. So the first of these is activities allowed or unallowed. So that is the big umbrella. And that is basically saying the purpose of the award is X. Did you actually use the money to do something that fell under the allowable uses of this money? And in this case, we've been talking for the last few weeks about what you're allowed to spend the ARPA money on. And so that's what this compliance requirement is. Did you actually use it for one of those intended allowed purposes? Or did you use it for debt service, which is not an allowable activity? So that would be a big X on your compliance there. You know, if you use it for debt service, you know, like on Family Feud, where the big X, that would be a big for that one. So to demonstrate these different requirements, what we thought we would do is use an example that might be something that our local governments would be looking at. That would kind of hit on all these different requirements. So what we're going to talk about is, let's say that you've got a town that wants to do parks within the town. Parks is not something that is specifically in one of those allowable buckets. However, this particular town happens to have some qualified census tract areas, which, as we mentioned earlier, if you have qualified census tracts, you have a lot of leeway as far as what types of things that you can do in those areas, because the theory is that those would be some of the most hardest hit communities. So in our example, our town has, let's say, about half the town is actually in a QCT, a qualified census tract, and the other half is not. But the town wants to do all the parks throughout the town. But when we look at activities allowed or unallowed, the parks in the QCT, that is an allowable activity. They can do that. The parks in the outside of the QCT, assuming that the town had revenue loss, and discuss the revenue loss calculation and how you have a lot of latitude as far as what you spend that money on. So the town had revenue loss, and they decided they wanted to take some of that money, which can be used for general government services, which parks would qualify. And then they decide, okay, we're going to do the parks outside of the QCTs using that money, which in that case, you do all the parks in the town, and that would qualify. You would meet the activities allowed or unallowed compliance requirement, but you need to document. So you need to document that we're doing these because it's a QCT area, and we're doing these because we're using the revenue loss. And then that's how you would document the compliance with the first requirement, which is activities allowed or unallowed. So that's the big umbrella. overall, what you're doing isn't allowed. The next compliance requirement is allowable costs. Now that we've determined that they can use the money for parks, what specifically can they spend the money on? And so it's things like you can spend the money for park equipment, but you can't spend it for lobbyists, right? So specifically, the individual expenditures that you are making, are those items allowable costs? And there is actually the uniform guidance, which is what the guiding document is for these single audits. The uniform guidance is in it. Part 3 has all the compliance requirements, and there is a table in there. It's quite a few pages that actually lists various types of expenditures and whether or not they are allowable costs or unallowable costs. And I'm looking at it right now. So employee morale, health, and welfare costs are allowable with restrictions. However, entertainment costs are unallowable. So you can go into this chart and you can look at specific things that you are planning to spend the money on and see whether or not it qualifies. Then the third one that we're going to talk about is eligibility. Eligibility has to do with who is actually receiving the benefit of what you're doing. If you are talking about the parks in the non-QCT area, it's general government services, and you should not have to really document anything for eligibility. However, the parks in the QCTs, the reason that it is an allowable item is because the QCTs are eligible. So you would document that, you would say, okay, well, here's this park, here's the map that actually shows the QCTs, and here's the park in the QCT, therefore it's an underserved area, and that qualifies for eligibility. And now Linda's going to talk to us about some of the other primary requirements.
Thank you, Jen. So one of the requirements, it covers equipment and real property management. And there, the requirement essentially that you need to continue to use that real property or the equipment for its original purpose. So in our example, if we were to buy park equipment, that's fairly straightforward. We're not going to change the use. If we were to do some capital improvements, say, for example, renovate the restrooms or ball fields at a park, those uses are not going to change. They're going to also be accounted for the same way that we would account for any other fixed asset at the government level. We'd include it in our fixed asset account group, just as we would any other asset. One of the more complicated areas is the period of availability. So the period of availability means the time frame within which we would have to actually spend the money. And it starts as of March 3rd, 2021. So we cannot use expenditures that were made prior to that date. It goes through December 31st, 2024. However, the uniform guidance, the interim final rule indicates that we can incur financial obligations through December 31st, 2026. So our initial period is that period from March 3rd, 2021 to December 31st, 2024, in which we have to expend the grant funds. The next area, procurement, suspension, and debarment, that for New York municipalities who are required to follow general municipal law with regard to bidding and their limits, that's fairly straightforward. However, we do have to review the federal debarment and suspension lists to make sure that any contractors that we are considering dealing with are not on those lists. However, the bid limits for New York State are lower than the federal limits. So therefore, following New York's requirements keeps us within compliance.
Hey, Linda, debarment is a weird word. What does that mean?
meaning that a particular contractor has been, quote, debarred from working on federal projects. And it's important that we follow that guidance and not contract with any contractors, because any payments to them would be disallowed.
So it's kind of like Santa's naughty and nice list, right? So
Yeah.
contractors on the naughty list, you can't deal with them.
Absolutely, absolutely. We also have reporting requirements, and the reporting requirements are different for whether you're an entitlement unit or a non-entitlement unit. The entitlement units reporting requirements start as of August 31st and are subject to quarterly reporting. And this is with the federal government, with the U.S. Treasury. The non-entitlement units, their first reporting requirement is due as of October 31st, and then annually thereafter. A little less burdensome, but again, you're going to be required to report to the Treasury how you spent the money and the justifications for spending that money. And so it's important when one is planning and spending the money to document the compliance with the allowed or activities and the allowable costs, as Jen was explaining earlier, because you're going to be reporting to the U.S. Treasury under those same guidelines. Those are the key, I believe, requirements. Do you agree, Jen?
Yes, I do agree. And just one thing I wanted to mention about the reporting is that you might say, well, the federal government's already getting these reports, so why do they need the auditor to then come behind them and say, did they file reports? The audit, when we're talking about the audit, the single audit, it's not just, did you file the reports and did you file them on time? The single audit, the auditor is actually looking at how did you get the information that went on the report, because the federal government needs to know that the information reported is accurate. So, all right.
Absolutely.
So there's another 5 requirements that are general federal award requirements that we're going to just touch on. They are not really going to play into this ARPA money. The first one is cash management, which I've mentioned before, is actually awesome that they have specifically said that does not apply to this funding, because cash management says that you are supposed to minimize the amount of time between when you get the federal money and when you spend it, and that if you earn interest on that money, you're supposed to actually give it back to the feds. They have, in this case, specifically said that will not apply, which is excellent because you're getting all this money up front. I mean, they're basically saying take the money and then figure out what you're going to do with it. So with cash management not being applicable, that means you can take that money, you can invest it because you're going to be sitting on it potentially for a few years, and then you get to keep the interest. You don't have to give it back to the federal government. That only is applicable to this particular award. So if you have other federal awards, cash management still applies. Another one is matching level of effort and earmarking. This is where the award might say the feds will give you 50% of the money and you have to put in 50%. Or you have to make sure that you are spending no more than 10% on administrative costs. There are no particular matching level of effort or earmarking requirements for this award, so we can ignore that one. Program income would come into play if you were actually generating income from something, from a program that you were using this federal money for. An example would be if you maybe got community development money that was going into a loan program. And so you were making loans and earning interest on those loans as people were repaying them, but the money was originally from federal award, then you would still have restrictions on that program income and what you would be able to do with that money. Highly unlikely that you would actually be generating program income from any of this funding. So move on from that. Another one is subrecipient monitoring. This comes into play if you are actually passing through the money to another entity who is going to actually be running the program. It's not if a contractor, like if you contract with somebody to come in and put in new water pipes, they are not a subrecipient, they are a contractor. However, in our park example, let's say that there was a not-for-profit who actually was in charge of maintaining and running a particular park. And so the town said, all right, we're going to take a portion of this money and turn it over to this not-for-profit, and they are going to do all the repairs and the upkeep on the park. In that case, because the not-for-profit would actually be the one administering the program, they would be considered a subrecipient. And in that case, the town would actually have monitoring requirements, because it's not just here's the money, have a good time. Just like the federal government is monitoring what you're doing with the money, you would actually have to monitor what the subrecipient was doing. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of that with our towns and villages and the smaller entities, but it's possible. If you do have a situation like that, just be aware that there are monitoring requirements. And then the last federal compliance requirement is special tests and provisions. And this is where, for a particular award, the federal government says, we want you to make sure that you're doing X. As of right now, we are not aware of any special tests and provisions. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some that come up, but as of now, we're not aware of any, so that we don't have to worry about that requirement. So those 5 are, just be aware that in the universe of federal awards, these are requirements. However, they're probably really not going to apply to this funding. And with that, I think that covers all of the compliance requirements. Linda, did you have any other thoughts you want to mention on the compliance requirements?
Just to make sure that any municipality that accepts these funds has to be aware that there are compliance requirements, whether or not you have a single audit. I mean, it's important to realize that you may not end up having a single audit. You may not meet that $750,000 threshold for all federal expenditures in a given year, but you're still required to meet all of these requirements and have controls in place to make sure that you do comply. So just want to remind everyone of that. It's important.
So thanks. We are just about at the half-hour mark, believe it or not. Time flies. And I see that we have a number of questions, and one of them kind of touches on what you just mentioned, Linda. Will all municipalities be subject to single audit?
So as I mentioned, not every municipality might hit the $750,000 threshold. And as a reminder, that threshold is all expenditures of all federal revenue from all sources. So it might, you might have some ARPA funding, you might have some community development block grant funding, you may have funding through the U.S. Department of Justice for policing. When you add up the expenditures for all that funding in your fiscal year, you still may not meet that $750,000 threshold. So it definitely depends on how you spend the money, whether or not you
expenditures, right? Not revenue.
Expenditures, absolutely. It is when you spend that fund, those funds, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Another question we've received: is a single audit the same as the Treasury reporting requirements? Jen, do you know the answer to that?
I do know the answer to that, and it is no. The federal reporting requirements are, you are required to annually submit for our towns and villages, for the NEUs. You're required to submit an annual report to the federal government, basically saying how you have spent the money. The single audit, as Linda said, would only be required if you spend $750,000 or more in a particular year. So if you are a organization that, you know, maybe you're getting $1 million in total, if you want to split it up, so you spend like 500,000 one year and 500,000 the next year, you're under 750,000 for both years, no single audit required. The other thing to note is that the reporting for the federal reporting is not covering your fiscal year. it is due by October 31st for the period ended September 30th. So I'm not aware of any state and local governments in New York that have a September 30 year end. And this is important because that means that when you are doing, and for this year, it's not going to be a big deal, right? Because it's going from March to September. Unless you're a village with a May 31 year end, then you're going to have to be pulling information from one year and the next. But everybody's going to be in that situation starting next year, because if you have a 12/31 year end, you're going to have to pull the information from the fourth quarter of last year and the first 3 quarters of this year to compile for your federal reporting. That will be important because you need to make sure that you're going to be able to run those reports from your accounting system. And the single audit covers your fiscal year and what you spent during that particular year. Some of the reporting elements are similar. So on the federal reporting, you are going to have to talk about eligibility. Now for most of the allowable costs, they want to know how was this affecting the underserved, disproportionately impacted communities. So the big thing I'm going to tell you is that you need to document. Make sure that you have support for everything that you're doing, why you decided to do it, go this way versus another way, and who was being impacted by the work that's being done.
Thank you. Another question we received is, how should a municipality prepare for a potential single audit? Linda, can you share your thoughts on that?
Certainly. So again, collecting the information on how you expended any federal funding is critical. That's your first step. Knowing all the different grants that might be applied for and expended during the year. Inquiring of your departments if the grant applications are actually going through, say, your police department or your highway department. One needs to have all of that information together. With that, you'll know what grants are being applied for and the money's being expended. So therefore, you as the CFO needs to be aware of the compliance requirements, hopefully in advance, so that you can make sure that the controls are in place, and modify if the controls aren't in place, establish them and modify them so that you are in compliance when the funding is actually expended. So it is definitely a planning process and a documentation process, as Jen mentioned, in terms of spending the ARPA funding, making sure that we have the allowable costs and the eligibility requirements, if they pertain, to be documented is very important.
Linda, I have a question. I'm sure this is on somebody's mind out there.
Mm-hmm.
You said all federal money. Are you talking about, like, if they get $1,000 seatbelt grant, they have to keep track of that too?
They do. That goes on. They schedule expenditures of federal awards. It's all federal sourced money. Yes. And sometimes it doesn't always come directly from the federal government. It would come through various departments of the state of New York. So one has to be sure and make inquiries of the ultimate source of the funding that they get.
So anybody who's passing through money to you, such as the state or the county, or it actually could be any number of entities that might pass through money, they are required to tell you that part of it, that it's federal money and how much of it is federal money. They're required to, doesn't mean that they always do, but also be aware that you might get some piece of paper that says, oh, hey, this grant, here's the CFDA number. Don't ignore that. You make sure you hang on to that, because that will be really important for putting together this schedule.
Great. So another question that we've received is, do I have to have a plan how to spend the money before I applied for the funds?
No, No, you don't have to have a plan yet. Just get the money.
Say thank you.
You have, you have some time to come up with a plan. I mean, I would be working on the plan, but when you apply to the state for your funding, you do not actually have to have a plan. You just need to go on and say, please send me the money. And there are a couple of documents that you have to sign, basically indicating that, yes, we are going to follow the guidelines, but you don't have to have a plan.
Great, thanks. Do we have to prove eligibility for infrastructure? Another question we just received. Jen, do you know?
Infrastructure is actually really the one element that you don't have to prove eligibility. And we should clarify that infrastructure, we're talking about water, sewer, and broadband, which includes stormwater. So that's the only eligible infrastructure under the grant. But for those items, you don't have to specifically say, oh, well, we're only doing a water system in an underserved area. The infrastructure can be done anywhere across the board. You do not have to prove that it is in an eligible community.
Great. Another question that we've received is, does a purchase order qualify as an incurred expense? Linda, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that brings up an interesting point, because under the uniform guidance, there's a definition of a financial obligation. And under that, and my understanding is that a valid purchase order would qualify, but it's an interesting question we're going to be posing to our standard setters to confirm. But right now, that's my understanding. Yes.
So, thank you. Another question that we have is, if we weren't able to run our summer rec program last year, can we count that as lost revenue even if we didn't incur any expenses?
Okay. The revenue loss calculation. We've been getting lots of questions about this revenue loss calculation. What you need to remember is that it's only looking at revenue. So whether or not you incurred any expenses is irrelevant for this calculation. So I completely understand the thought pattern behind it. Well, if we didn't run the rec program yet, we didn't get the money, but we also didn't spend anything. So really net, there's really no impact. However, from the revenue loss calculation, if in 2019 you ran your summer rec program and you generated $100,000 from this summer rec program of revenue, not bottom line, we're talking about revenue. And then in 2020, you weren't able to run the summer rec program. That means, all things being equal, your revenue was $100,000 less in 2020 than it was in 2019. So that definitely does factor into your revenue loss calculation. But I can't stress this enough. It is your top line revenue number, not your bottom line, net income.
Great point. Thank you for sharing that. So I think we're done with the questions. So I'm going to go ahead, and I think as a final reminder, we just want to remind everyone not to forget to request funding by this Friday, July 9th. And I think the statistic that you shared with me earlier, Jen, was that as of July 1st, only 50% of New York State NEUs had submitted requests, which is bizarre because frankly, it's free money out there. So get your requests in by July 9th.
Could I actually just do one quick follow-up on that?
Please.
We were discussing earlier before the show started that we've had a lot of questions from smaller municipalities that are not sure how they're going to be able to meet one of these eligible uses because they don't have a water sewer system in their town, or they really didn't have any revenue loss. Still apply for the funding, because you get the funding and you hold on to it for a few years, you earn interest on it, you get to keep the interest, even if at the end of the day you aren't able to spend all of the money on eligible uses, you have to give the principal back. You still were able to generate some interest on that money. So please just go out and get the funding.
Excellent point. So I think that's about all the time we have today, but thanks for joining us. And special thanks to our experts, Jen George and Linda Hannigan. Thank you. If we didn't get to your question or something comes to mind later this week, please email the team and we'll do our very best to get right back to you. Today's program will be available on our website, www.rbtcpas.com, for future reference. Next week, same time, we plan to have another special guest, so mark your calendars. And finally, a special thank you to Eric Grove, our IT expert, Aaron Waddell, and Tori Lewandowski in our marketing group, and to Mike Turturro, our managing partner and executive producer. So thank you for tuning in today and have a great week.